So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which means that it is the molecule that allows the electrical signal from the presynaptic neuron to be communicated to the postsynaptic neuron, because there's a little gap called the synapse between those two neurons. So neurotransmitters allow fine-tuning of those electrical signals. And dopamine is the most important neurotransmitter involved in motivation and reward. And the fundamental difference between things that are addictive and those that aren't is that things that are addictive release a lot more dopamine. So we have dopamine firing in our brain that occurs at a tonic baseline. And when we do something that's rewarding or pleasurable, we get a little rise in dopamine levels or a spike. So for example, chocolate increases dopamine levels about 50% above baseline. Sex is about 100%. Nicotine is about 150%. And things like methamphetamines are 1,000%. Mm-hmm. Partially because of their specific mechanism. But the fundamental way that I explain to patients and medical students, and now in my book, about the neuroscience of addiction so that they can really understand what's happening in the brain, is I say that really you have to imagine that in your brain there's a balance, like a teeter-totter in a playground. When we experience pleasure, the balance tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the other. But one of the fundamental rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. So with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. Mm-hmm. So for example, if I do something pleasurable, like eat a piece of chocolate, I get a little tip to the side of pleasure, a little release of dopamine. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that phenomenon by downregulating my own dopamine receptors, downregulating my own dopamine transmission. And I imagine that as these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But the thing about the gremlins is they like it on the balance, so they stay on until the balance is tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's called the opponent process reaction, the hangover, the come down, the after effect. Now, and in my case, that's that moment of wanting another piece of chocolate. If I wait long enough, the gremlin hops off and balance is restored. But if I continue to consume chocolate in ever larger amounts to overcome the tolerance or the number of gremlins on the pain side, then I end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. And I'm essentially in a dopamine deficit state, mm-hmm. with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Now I have to keep using, not to feel good, but just to feel normal. And when I stop using, my balance tips hard to the side of pain. I'm irritable, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I can't sleep. Those are the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance. And that can last a long time. We live in a world in which we are saturated with dopamine, and we live in a culture which encourages us to pursue it. But the ultimate end result of pursuing dopamine is to feel worse than when you started. And this is really the central message. People are more depressed, more anxious, more suicidal, and more addicted than they were 30 years ago. And I contend that one of the main reasons is because of this relentless pursuit of pleasure that essentially adjusts the dopamine levels, changes the hedonic or pleasure set point to make people anhedonic, meaning without joy.
These addictive behaviors, substances are ubiquitous. It used to just be, hard drugs and alcohol and cigarettes, et cetera. But now it's literally everything from, the billboards and the advertisements and the marketing messages crafted by Madison Avenue to, of course, the devices that we all carry around with us that are specifically designed to lure us into this, dopamine-induced state, and the food system that's specifically designing foods with the right proportion of salt, sugar, and fat to make it impossible to just eat one potato chip.
Yes, exactly. I mean, addiction can happen now in every realm of life. It's almost impossible to escape it. And the three factors that make anything more addictive are quantity, potency, and novelty. And what our capitalist, technologically innovative world has created is an infinite quantity, incredible potency, and endless novelty and variety.
Yeah. and ubiquitous availability.
Yes,
right.
right. And
it's
the smartphone.
unavoidable.
Yes, right.
Now.
And now it's 24/7 and it's digital and it's right to your doorstep. Exactly.
And as I learn about dopamine and the difference between craving something versus getting something, and you get into dopamine and how dopamine's really about wanting something. And that's when I realized I might just be really good at tying wanting something to a flood of dopamine, which makes me feel good. And then I'm very careful to make sure that only the pursuit matters. And so then if you're careful that the pursuit is what I call exciting and honorable,
Right.
so that you're not chasing things that are self-destructive or detrimental to other people. In fact, they elevate other people. You get into this really interesting self-reinforcing loop. So I'm curious if you've thought about the positive side of dopamine.
I love the way you articulated that. That is actually my life philosophy as well, that the process is really what matters and not the outcome. But I guess I've never thought about it or framed it in terms of the neuroscience of dopamine. It seems that you're suggesting that your drug is the pursuit and that you get dopamine from that. And whether or not your efforts lead to the desired outcome is separate from
You have to make it
your
separate.
rewarding experience.
Otherwise,
Right.
you're playing a dangerous game.
Yeah.
Because you said in the book, the humans are the ultimate seekers,
Yes.
if I remember the phrase
Yes.
correctly.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, yes, that is exactly true.
Yeah.
And if you seek poorly, meaning blindly, that you don't realize that you're a seeking machine, that nature has handcrafted you to seek versus have,
Right.
because you can never eat a meal big enough where you don't need to eat again. So it's like nature had to find that way to keep you going.
Yes.
And so many people think that, wealth is usually the one, right? If I could just get that amount of money, I would feel good.
Right.
And of course it won't work.
Yeah. I mean, I think what the wisdom that you're offering, which I think is really valuable, is the reward itself, whatever it is, might be rewarding the first time around, but then over time, the way that we're wired will make it less reinforcing, less rewarding. So then we need a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So ultimately, the reward itself is not the thing to seek because it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's ever elusive. But I want to ask you something because, you say that for you, it's the seeking that is the source of the reward itself. And yet you have been very successful in your life. So it's been a positive reinforcing loop. It might be that your trajectory is very long so that you're really good at delaying gratification. On the other hand, it seems like you get there, you get your goal. So I guess I'm wondering what you would say with this kind of frame, if the goal really is not achieved and if it's repeatedly not achieved, how do you then say to somebody, it's just about the pursuit?
Yeah, you've gone right to the deep end of the pool. So this is really the secret to success is I want being a good person to be enough. Like when I advise people about business, your goal really does need to be honorable. Now in a hyper-connected social age, you'll get raked if you're not after good things.
Right.
But unfortunately, being a good person isn't enough. And so you have to also be business savvy. So I amended a word to my phrase around pursuit to be sincere pursuit. So I wake up every day sincerely pursuing my goal. So my goal is to build the next Disney. Now that's a dizzying endeavor, right? So they have a 90-year head start. They have billions of dollars in revenue, billions of dollars in IP. Like the odds of me pulling it off are vanishingly slim. So I know better than to hold myself accountable to actually building the next Disney. And by the way, that's so far in the future that even if I do it on an accelerated time frame, what are we talking, 10 years, 20 years? Like that would be astronomically fast. So to be able to sustain myself for 2 decades, in the case of like just rampant success, I'm murdering it. Just every day is a victory. That would be such prolonged gratification. I'd never make it, right? So on the days where even I don't feel like getting out of bed or I'm being kicked in the face by some just unending string of failures, you really have to say the thing I'm going to value myself for right in this moment is sincerely pursuing this goal, because it's tempting to just play rhetoric, right? And you can actually get away with that for a while, where people buy into the rhetoric. It makes them feel good to, in today's social climate, they can watch me pursue my dreams, my huge dreams. Maybe I fail. They can live by proxy. And so for some period of time, I could get away with just rhetoric and I can still gain followers and all that. But because I hold myself accountable to sincere pursuit, even if people are cheering me on and saying that, oh my God, this is amazing, and I love that you have this big dream, I'm looking at myself going, did I actually measure myself against the progress I would need to make to build the next Disney, to take the real steps towards doing that? And so being able to assess from a business perspective, what's real? Am I actually making progress? But the tricky part is I'm not valuing myself when the answer is I have failed and I've, let's say, even moved backwards. It was, but did I really play to win? And if I showed up and played to win, but failed, I still emotionally reward myself. If I win, but I'm not actually playing to win, then I don't cheer myself on. And that is nuanced perhaps, but it really matters. And so I end up on a long time frame, because I fail a lot, but on a long time frame, because I'm learning from those failures, I actually make progress.
So it sounds like you have some kind of intrinsic reward that you give yourself based on kind of this sort of morality you've created around trying your hardest. Is that sort of
That's part of it. But I think a little bit so in the book, you talk about how you can put a running wheel, like a rat running wheel, if people can imagine that little metal mesh thing, in the wild, and yet the animals will still go and play on it.
Right.
And so there is, and I'd be curious to know what you think from an evolutionary standpoint, is that the rats, or because it was like frogs, rats, snails, like all these different creatures come and play on this thing. Is it that nature needed them to be willing to do hard things in order to escape predation?
Well, I mean, I think we are hardwired to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and that's really at the heart of our dopamine reward system. And you're absolutely right. Dopamine is not just about the reward. It's also about the wanting and the motivation. And it's relative dopamine. So it's whether our dopamine is above or below tonic baseline that really is at the heart of this motivational cycle. From an evolutionary perspective, the just so story that we can tell ourselves is that the reason that Mother Nature made a reward pathway that doesn't just give us the reward, but also makes us pay for it afterwards by going into this dopamine deficit state is because that's the ideal biological system to drive us to continue to seek to never be contented with what we have. And what I'm finding very interesting in talking to you is that your kind of, let's say, life hack in the modern ecosystem where we have everything we could ever really want, and where this type of, physiologic with this drive toward homeostasis and this pleasure-pain balance and the dopamine deficit state, which I'm going to assume because you read the book, you understand.
We're going to have to go into the pleasure-pain. That is so interesting.
Yeah.
But finish that thought. I'll bring us back to it.
It's like a nature's cruel trick in the modern ecosystem, because it essentially turns us all into people with addiction because we have everything. So that constant pursuit, that never being satisfied with what we have, with always wanting more, gets us into this trap of compulsive overconsumption or addiction. But you have decided that the way to sort of manage that reality is to make the pursuit the heart of it, knowing that you may not get it, but that is not the most important piece, that the most important piece is to pursue and to be honorable about it, right? And to give it your best shot, so to speak.
I define addiction as the continued compulsive use of a drug or behavior despite harm to self and or others. How do you define it?
I mean, that's the standard definition.
Yeah, right.
And how does that, like, as I mentioned at the opening, there's alcoholism, there's drug addiction. There are some qualitative differences between substance addiction and behavioral addictions. And now that we're in this world where everything has an addictive allure to it, do you qualify our relationship with our devices and online shopping and gambling in the same way? Like, with this idea of addiction being a spectrum, how does it differ in terms of like our relationship to Twitter versus our relationship to heroin?
I don't really see all that much difference between those things. I think it's just a matter of degree. Obviously, when we're talking about heroin, we're talking about the physiologic dependence and withdrawal as well, which I do think happens with behavioral addictions to things like Twitter. I believe we can have a true physiologic dependence and withdrawal to those behaviors, but not to the same degree as with something like an opioid. But in terms of the psychological aspect of the attachment, I think it's very, very similar. And I believe that because I've seen so many people come through my office who are addicted to things like gaming, gambling, pornography, shopping, and the natural history is exactly the same. The manifestations are the same. The process of getting into recovery is the same. So to me, they're all one bucket.
So is there a distinction between kind of an unhealthy, recurring, semi-compulsive habit and what you would consider truly an addiction?
Because both habits and addictive behaviors work through our dopamine reward pathway, I really think it's the same biology. It's just a matter of degree. And because I have seen people who can get severely addicted to behaviors like gambling, pornography, video games, to the point where they are suicidal, so their life is threatened by that disease process or that behavior, I really think it's the same biochemistry. It's the same phenomenon in the brain.
Yeah. It seems to me we're in this weird time where, on the one hand, we use the word addiction very cavalierly, like, oh, I'm addicted to my TV show or chocolate or what have you. And yet at the same time, we underappreciate the fact that some of these things truly are addictions, right? Like these two things kind of cross each other in the night in a weird way, which I think prevents us from really looking at them through the appropriate clinical lens.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the way that we cavalierly refer to behaviors as addictions, oh, I'm addicted to whatever, my Netflix show, does minimize the extent to which the brain biology is the same, and also minimizes the impact on our lives. Because if we were to really scrutinize that behavior, I think people would begin to realize that it really truly does have an adverse impact on their lives, and that, we can't trivialize that. I mean, I've had, for example, journalists writing for esteemed publications, call me to interview me about sex addiction and say to me, well, it's not really an addiction, is it? I mean, it's really just about cultural mores around, what's acceptable sexual behavior and what isn't. And I've had to correct that person and say, no, you're wrong. This is really an addiction. It can devastate lives. People can lose their lives over these problems. And it's not just about, polyamory should be socially accepted. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a compulsive, out-of-control phenomenon that has very serious consequences for people's lives.
If anybody questions that, I encourage you to read the first chapter of your book, because it's the most harrowing, bone-chilling story of a sex addict, and the lengths that guy goes to satisfy his need.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the fact that he's highly educated, that he's a good and kind person, that he has good social supports, he has a great job. I mean, this is what I really want to drive home to people. Like, yeah, there are many risk factors for addiction, but you can have none of those risk factors in today's world and get really addicted.
Do you feel like we're starting to understand that, in the sense that anybody can be an addict regardless of your social status or level of education, et cetera?
I do think so. I mean, I do think we've moved beyond this moralizing around addiction as more and more people struggle with severe addiction, and it crosses all demographics, all social classes. I think people I mean, for example, in surveys of Americans asking whether or not they think addiction is a biologically based disease, the majority of Americans today will say, yes, it is. And that's different from 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think we have shifted in that regard. But I think what's still new to people is the extent to which we've all become vulnerable to this problem.
Yeah, that is a big difference.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think, although we may recognize that truth in that there is this biological component to it, we still are shocked when we hear the story of the upwardly mobile person who goes down some dark rabbit hole. Do you remember that? There was a New York Times article a couple of years ago about the lawyer in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
That was like a huge profile
Yes.
of his his other life.
Yes.
And I just remember how, people were so shocked by that story. As somebody who's been in recovery for a long time, I'm like, yeah, I hear that story all the time.
Right.
But I remember that being a big deal.
Yeah, I think that there's still this kind of self-medication hypothesis thinking around addiction, which is only partially true. And the hypothesis goes like this, that addiction is the result of some other problem, either a willpower problem or a psychiatric illness problem or, a sociocultural problem. But you can have none of those problems and still get addicted. And that's what's like, I've spent a major part of my career re-educating, in particular, psychiatrists around this idea, because for so long we've had this idea that addiction is a downstream consequence of some other problem. But addiction is its own problem. You can have a perfect life and get very, very addicted. So what I'd like to do is really tell the story of how our brains have evolved over millions of years to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and how we do that reflexively. And then I'd like to talk about how this ancient wiring, which has been so important for our survival, is actually not working out very well for us in the modern world, where we have access to so many feel-good substances and behaviors right at our fingertips. And then I'd like to talk about what we can do about it as individuals by understanding this through the lens of neuroscience, specifically advances in the neuroscience of addiction, but also holding up people in recovery from addiction as modern day prophets for the rest of us for how to navigate this dopamine saturated world. So let's start with the brain. One of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 50 to 75 years is that pain and pleasure are co-located in our brains. So the same parts of our brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like a balance. So if you imagine there's like a board on a central fulcrum, kind of like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, but when that balance is at rest, it's level with the ground. So when we do something pleasurable, our balance tips to the side of pleasure, and when we experience pain, it tips to the side of pain. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance after any deviation from neutrality. And that level balance is called homeostasis. So let's say, for example, in my case, I eat a piece of chocolate, or I read a romance novel, or I watch a YouTube video of Dr. Pimple Popper. These are all activities that are highly reinforcing for me. I get a little tip of my pleasure-pain balance deep in the emotion centers of my brain. And I get a little release of dopamine in that reward pathway. So dopamine is a very interesting molecule. It was actually only discovered as a human neurotransmitter in the 1950s. Neurotransmitters are those molecules that allow two neurons to communicate. So neurons are these long, spindly cells in our brains that transmit the electrical circuit that make us who we are, but they don't actually touch end to end. There's a little gap called the synapse, and that gap is bridged by neurotransmitters, which allow this very careful neuromodulation. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of the fundamental neurotransmitters in our experience of pleasure, motivation, and reward. And it might even be more important for motivation than it is, in fact, for pleasure. For example, there's a very famous experiment where scientists engineered a rat to have no dopamine. And what they discovered was when they put food into the rat's mouth, it ate the food and seemed to get pleasure from eating and swallowed the food. But if they put that food even a single body length away, the rat would starve to death. So it wasn't motivated to get up and go get the food. Suggesting indeed that dopamine has this fairly fundamental role, not just in the experience of pleasure, but in our motivation to do the work to get the reward. Okay, so when we do something pleasurable, the balance tips to the side of pleasure, we release dopamine in that part of the brain called the reward pathway. Also keep in mind that we always have a tonic baseline level of dopamine firing. And really what we're talking about as key here is the deviations either up or down from that baseline level as really key to creating the various behaviors that we're going to be talking about. But remember that as soon as I get a deviation from baseline, my brain will work very hard to restore a level balance or homeostasis. And the way that my brain does that is by downregulating dopamine transmission and downregulating dopamine receptors, not just back down to baseline levels, but actually below baseline. So one of the ways to imagine that is to imagine that there are these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of my balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until I'm tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's called the come down, the opponent process mechanism, the after effect, the hangover. We're all probably familiar with that in various forms. But I will say that the extreme version, like a hangover, is something that we can all see. What we're less aware of is the more subtle urge to repeat that behavior that's maybe not even within our conscious awareness. So, for example, after I'm done watching a Dr. Pimple Popper YouTube video, I have this kind of strange compulsion to watch it again. That is my mini dopamine deficit state that kind of compels it. I don't even really exactly know why. I may not even really want to watch another Dr. Pimple Popper video, but somehow I'm compelled to do it. That's that dopamine deficit state. This is a very powerful state of physiology because, again, the brain wants to restore homeostasis or a level balance, and will work very hard to do that. And so will get us to do the work to get our next reward. Now, if I don't reach for another reward, right? Let's say it's all done, like I ran out. Then time passes and those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off. I start to upregulate my own dopamine receptors and transmission. And again, homeostasis is restored. I've got a level balance and I can kind of go on with my day. But now we're going to imagine the scenario in which I have plenty of that reward and I have plenty of access to it. And also it's a highly reinforcing, engineered to be highly dopamine releasing kind of reward. So now I don't just have one, I have another and another and another, and I'm doing that over days to weeks to months to years. And what happens is that I eventually end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. And they are camped out there. They have their tents and their barbecues. They're not going anywhere soon. This is essentially the addicted brain. I've now reset my hedonic pathway so that I am chronically tilted to the side of pain. I'm in what's called a dopamine deficit state. And that is something that, once created, does not easily reverse itself. And when I'm in that state, essentially now I need to use my drug of choice, not to feel good, but just to get out of this painful state and feel normal. And when I'm not using, I'm walking around with the balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving, intrusive thoughts of wanting to use, often manifested by a physiologic urge to try to relieve the pain that I'm feeling. And this is exactly why people with severe addiction will often relapse even months after stopping, when it's so obvious that their lives are so much better,
because they're not walking around with a level balance, right? They're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Their whole cerebral cortex has become narrowed on trying to manage the craving and pain of their dopamine deficit state. And so every day is an exhaustion, and they finally get to a point where they just kind of relent, give in, and do what they physiologically feel they must do in order to restore homeostasis. So, my goodness, why on earth would Mother Nature put us to such a test to build, a circuit in our brain that has us approaching pleasure and avoiding pain through this opponent process mechanism or this pleasure-pain balance? It seems like some kind of cruel joke. But if you remember that we have evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, it makes perfect sense, right? What better way to keep us searching and seeking and motivated than to make sure that any pleasure we experience is very temporary and is indeed followed by its opposite, a state of painful craving that then has us seeking the next best thing. It's absolutely genius to keep us alive in a world where resources are incredibly scarce and where we have to constantly be on alert in order to survive. Station number 2. Remember with our pleasure-pain balance that when that initial stimulus is pleasure, those gremlins hop on the pain side, and with repeated exposure, we can end up in this dopamine deficit state. Well, the gremlins are agnostic to the initial stimulus. So if we start out by pressing on the pain side, those gremlins are actually going to hop on the pleasure side and help us reset our balance to the side of pleasure. So what I recommend to patients and recommend to you, if you want to engage in this experiment, is that in addition to abstaining from your drug of choice for a period of time, that you also invite painful activities into your life. And I actually mean physically painful. So things like exercise, things like ice cold water baths, but also cognitively and psychologically challenging tasks like doing something, that's intellectually very challenging, or engaging in a social interaction that maybe involves experiencing shame. Or I'm going to talk about radical truth telling in a second, telling the truth that's really painful when we have to expose, ways in which we've been selfish or harmed others. What happens essentially when we do that is that we tell the body that there's been an injury, and the body then starts to upregulate production of dopamine, and so then speeds up that return to homeostasis, or even ultimately resets things to the side of pleasure. Now, of course, it's also possible to get addicted to pain if we press too hard and too fast on the pain side of the balance, like cutting on ourselves or extreme forms of exercise that our bodies aren't ready for. That is not good. And essentially, then it becomes, in that same vicious cycle. So we want to be really thoughtful about that.